The wind over the Atlantic was cruel in 1942, cold, endless, and full of ghosts. Every night, British sailors stared into the black ocean, listening for the sound they dreaded most, the hollow boom of a torpedo, the whisper of a German U-boat stalking beneath the waves. The sea had turned into a graveyard. Convoys burned silently under moonlight. Cargo ships vanished without a trace. Every crossing felt like a gamble with fate. Britain was bleeding steel. Each ship that sank was another lifeline to America cut apart. And in London, Winston Churchill sat beneath a haze of cigar smoke, reading report after report of losses, his face lit only by the glow of a single lamp. Something had to change. He needed a miracle, something so unconventional it would make even the cold Atlantic tremble. Then came the letter. It was short, strange, and brilliant, written by a man few in government had ever heard of, Geoffrey Pyke. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even an engineer. He was a dreamer, one of those odd men who seemed to live half in reality, half in imagination. And in that letter, he proposed something that sounded like lunacy. "Prime Minister," he wrote, "I suggest we build a ship, but not a ship of steel, a ship of ice." At first, Churchill laughed. He thought it was a joke. But as he read further, his laughter turned into quiet wonder. A ship made of ice, stronger than steel, cheaper than metal, and unsinkable in the North Atlantic. It could carry squadrons of aircraft across the ocean, defending convoys from the deadly German submarines. And if a torpedo hit it, it wouldn't explode, it would simply heal, freezing itself back together. The more Churchill read, the more his imagination caught fire. He summoned his ministers. They stared at the paper, silent. Finally, someone said, "But sir, it would melt." Churchill grinned. Then he said, "We shall keep it cold." And so, in the heart of the war, a secret project was born, one that sounded like something out of a fairy tale, and yet was real enough to change history. They called it Project Habbakuk, named after a verse from the Bible. "Be astonished and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told to you." And that verse could not have been more fitting, because what Britain was about to attempt was beyond belief. In a hidden corner of the Canadian wilderness, where pine trees whispered under endless snow, a small team of scientists prepared to test the strangest material ever invented. It was ice, but not just ice. A mixture of frozen water and wood pulp, stronger than concrete, resistant to melting, and tougher than steel. They called it Pykrete, a name born from its inventor, Pyke, and the word concrete. No one could believe what they saw. Bullets bounced off it. Axes barely scratched it. Even fire could not melt it fast enough. For the first time, Britain's wildest dream had a body, cold, solid, and waiting to be shaped into a weapon. And so the race began, to build an aircraft carrier made of ice, a floating glacier of war, large enough to carry planes and strong enough to survive the Atlantic's fury. The men who worked on it called it the Berg ship, but history would remember it by the name whispered in Churchill's office that night, the Ice Aircraft Carrier. Project Habbakuk begins. Winter wrapped the Canadian wilderness in silence. The trees stood heavy with snow, and the air was so cold that breath turned into silver mist before it even touched the ground. Here, far from the noise of the war,
A secret team gathered beside a frozen lake called Lake Patricia. It was the perfect hiding place, deep in Jasper National Park, surrounded by mountains and mystery. No one passing by would have guessed that beneath the stillness of that frozen water, a dream unlike any other was taking shape. They arrived in small groups, British engineers, Canadian soldiers, and scientists with strange accents and stranger ideas. Their orders were clear: build a ship made of ice. They called it Project Habbakuk, and everything about it felt biblical, impossible, miraculous, and faintly mad. At first, they tried pure ice. It cracked, it shattered, it melted under sunlight. The dream seemed to crumble before it even began. But then someone remembered Pike's formula, a secret recipe written in the margins of his notes. Add wood pulp to the water. So they did. They mixed sawdust into the freezing lake water, stirring the slush until it thickened like porridge. They poured it into wooden molds, waited through the night, and returned in the morning to find something new. Not fragile ice, not brittle snow, but a substance both strange and strong. A soldier took an axe to it. The blade bounced off. Another fired his pistol. The bullet buried itself halfway, leaving only a faint mark. The scientists exchanged glances. One whispered, "It's alive." They had created a miracle, a material that could float like ice, but fight like armor. Pike was right.
They named it Pykrete, and as word reached London, Churchill demanded a demonstration. They carried 2 blocks into a secret meeting room, one of pure ice, one of Pykrete. An officer raised his gun and fired. The ice shattered instantly. Then he fired at the second block. The bullet ricocheted. Men ducked. One admiral nearly lost his hat. When the smoke cleared, the Pykrete block stood untouched. Churchill smiled through the haze of cigar smoke. His eyes glittered with excitement. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "build me a fleet of these." Soon, plans were drawn for something enormous, a ship so vast it could carry entire squadrons of bombers across the sea. They imagined a runway stretching the length of 10 football fields, hangars carved from frozen walls, and engines buried deep in the ice, their exhaust pipes steaming like breath from a sleeping giant. It would be unsinkable. It would be unstoppable. It would be alive. And somewhere in that frozen Canadian forest, as the snow fell quietly on Lake Patricia, the first pieces of that dream began to take form, layer by layer, frozen into being by hands numb from cold and hope. But the world didn't know. No one outside the project even guessed that in a remote corner of the British Empire, men were trying to build a mountain that could float. The war raged on across Europe. Cities burned, nations trembled, and in silence, the ice aircraft carrier began its secret life beneath the northern stars. The prototype rises on Lake Patricia. Morning came slowly over the Canadian wilderness. The lake lay silent under a blanket of frost, its surface glowing pale blue beneath the rising sun. The men working there were exhausted. Their beards carried icicles, their breath hung heavy in the air, and their gloves were stiff with frozen sweat. But today felt different. Today, they would see if a dream could float. They had been working for weeks, building something that had never existed before. At first glance, it looked like a crude wooden raft, but beneath its rough exterior lay a secret core, a skeleton of timber,
pipes and Pykrete blocks layered together like the bones of a giant. As the workers stepped back, they saw it begin to move. The massive slab of ice shifted, creaked, and then, gracefully, it rose from the lake. It floated. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of the wind whispered through the trees. Then a voice broke the silence. "It floats! It actually floats!" Laughter followed. Weary, disbelieving laughter. Some of the men cheered. Others just stood, watching the light dance across the frozen surface of the world's first ice ship. The structure was small, barely 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and shaped more like a barge than a battleship. But to the people who built it, it was proof that the impossible was possible. Beneath the ice, a network of pipes carried cool air through its heart, powered by small engines to keep the Pykrete from melting. If they could build this, they could build something far greater. Something that could cross oceans.
The tests began immediately. Soldiers climbed onto the icy deck and stomped their boots. The surface barely shuddered. They fired rifles at its hull. The bullets buried themselves harmlessly in the frozen wall. They swung axes. The blades bounced back. They even drilled into it and watched as the water slowly refroze, sealing the wound as if the ship were alive. The team stood in awe. This was not just frozen water. It was something else, something new. Soon, word of the success reached London. In a secret report sent to the Admiralty, the Canadian commander wrote, "The prototype remains solid and buoyant. The Pykrete material demonstrates remarkable resilience. The concept, though unorthodox, is sound." When Churchill read those words, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Outside, the bombs still fell on Europe, but somewhere across the ocean, an iceberg was learning to float. And yet, there was no celebration, no headlines, no victory parade. Only quiet satisfaction in a frozen forest, where men worked through the nights, their faces lit by lanterns, their hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. They didn't know it yet, but the frozen barge they had built would one day vanish without a trace, swallowed by the same lake that had given it life. For now, though, it was alive. The impossible had taken shape beneath the stars.
The dream of a frozen fortress. Winter, 1943. The war had entered its darkest hour. The Atlantic was bleeding. Every week, Allied convoys were being hunted and torn apart by German U-boats. The ocean, once the lifeline of Britain, had become its graveyard. Churchill paced inside his bunker, a cigar burning low between his fingers. He had read the reports from Canada, the floating block of ice that refused to sink. He stopped, turned to his aide, and said quietly, "If it floats on a lake, it will float on the sea." The orders went out in secret. Plans began for a vessel unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. It would be called Habbakuk, named after a prophet who once said, "Behold ye among the nations, and wonder and be astonished." It was a fitting name, because what they were about to build would make the world stop and stare. The vision was colossal, a ship 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and 200 feet thick, carved entirely from reinforced ice. It would weigh over 2 million tons, carry 150 aircraft, and be nearly unsinkable. Torpedoes would shatter against its icy armor. Fire would melt only its surface, and even then, the ship's own cooling vanes would refreeze it again. It was not a ship. It was an artificial iceberg, a floating fortress, a miracle of nature reborn through war.
The Admiralty called it a potential game changer. Imagine a moving runway in the middle of the Atlantic, where Allied bombers could refuel, fighters could patrol, and convoys could find shelter. The Germans would no longer own the ocean. Britain would. Churchill wrote directly to Lord Mountbatten. This project is one of the most original and daring ever conceived. Proceed with all speed. I want a prototype as soon as possible. And so began one of the strangest collaborations of the war. Scientists, naval officers, engineers, and physicists gathered in frozen huts in Alberta, far from enemy eyes. They drew sketches of massive propellers turning through slush, runways stretching half a kilometer long, and hangars carved from crystal ice. Each day, the dream grew larger. Each night, the doubts grew louder. "Can it really be done?" one engineer asked. "Even ice has limits." But Mountbatten only smiled. So did flight. So did radar. So did everything, until we built it. They calculated the structure's strength, its melting point, its cooling system, and its fuel demands. Miles of insulated piping would be needed to keep the internal temperature below freezing. Tons of wood pulp and sawdust would have to be shipped across oceans just to make the Pykrete. The cost would be astronomical. But for now, no one cared about cost. They cared only about victory. As the war raged on, the world didn't know that somewhere in a silent Canadian forest, men were planning to build an aircraft carrier made of ice, bigger than anything that had ever sailed. It was beautiful, it was mad, and it was, for a time, completely possible.
The cracks beneath the ice. The spring thaw came early that year. The pines around Lake Patricia began to drip with melting snow. The surface of the lake rippled with sunlight, and beneath it, the great ice prototype groaned like something alive. It had survived months of tests. It had proven that ice could float, could resist bullets, could even heal itself. But now, under the weight of its own success, it began to change. The cooling system, a web of pipes carrying frigid air through its heart, began to falter. Engineers noticed cracks forming along the edges, tiny fissures at first, but growing deeper as the sun returned. One morning, a worker shouted, "It's leaking!" A stream of water trickled down the side of the structure, glinting in the light. They patched it. It froze again. But the message was clear. Time was not on their side. Back in London, the War Cabinet received mixed reports. The scientists were proud, but the admirals were nervous. They looked at the blueprints, a floating iceberg 2,000 feet long, and wondered how on earth they would ever move it. How to keep it frozen in the middle of the Atlantic, under the burning summer sun. The numbers were staggering. To build the full-sized Habbakuk, they would need 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 25,000 tons of steel, and a network of refrigeration plants stretching from Canada to the sea. It would take thousands of men and millions of pounds. The British Empire, bleeding and bombed, could barely feed its people, and here it was, dreaming of ice ships. Lord Mountbatten visited the test site in person. He stepped onto the frozen deck, felt the cracks beneath his boots, and sighed. "It's a brilliant idea," he said quietly, "but perhaps born too soon." Even so, the dream didn't die easily. Some still believed it could work, if only they could make it bigger, colder, stronger. But as the weeks passed, the tide of war began to shift. American factories were now producing escort carriers, small steel warships that could do the same job without the need for ice or miracles.
The Atlantic, once a graveyard, was slowly becoming a highway again. The convoys sailed safely, the wolf packs scattered. The urgent need for Habbakuk faded like mist. In Canada, the frozen prototype sat quietly on Lake Patricia. The workers left, the machines stopped, and the lake slowly took back what was hers. By the time summer came, the once great experiment had melted into memory. Only a few pipes and wooden frames remained, sinking beneath the green water. No one came to see it go. No speeches were made. The world simply moved on. Yet those who were there never forgot. They had seen men build a dream out of ice and watched it melt in their hands. One engineer later wrote, "We believed we were shaping the future, but the future melted away before we could touch it." Still, the idea of Pykrete lived on in whispers, in labs, in textbooks, and in the minds of dreamers who refused to stop imagining. Because sometimes the most extraordinary inventions don't have to fly, or fight, or even survive. They just have to prove that the impossible can be imagined.
Echoes of ice. What remains of Habbakuk? Decades passed. The world changed. The war that once consumed the planet became just stories in books, films on old reels, and names carved into stone. Lake Patricia, too, changed. The forest grew thick around it. The winds no longer carried the sound of hammers or saws, only the gentle whisper of pines brushing together. But beneath the still, dark water, something remained. In the summer of 1970, a group of divers arrived at the lake. They had read fragments of a classified report, a rumor that somewhere below the surface lay the bones of a forgotten war experiment, a ship made of ice. They set up their gear in silence. The air was cold, and the lake mist rose like breath from another world. Then, one by one, they slipped beneath the water. The world below was silent, timeless. Fish drifted through shafts of green light. Branches of drowned trees reached upward like fingers. And then they saw it. Half buried in the silt, wrapped in ghostly strands of algae, lay metal pipes, wooden beams, and fragments of something once vast. The divers hovered in awe. The ice was long gone, but the skeleton of the dream was still there. They had found Habbakuk. News spread quietly. Historians came to confirm it. Old engineers, now with white hair and trembling hands, smiled when they heard, "So it's still there, after all this time." It wasn't just the remains of an experiment. It was a message from a time when imagination had no limits. Today, if you visit Jasper National Park in Alberta and paddle across the still waters of Lake Patricia, you might notice something strange on your sonar, a faint outline below, where history sleeps in ice-cold silence. Most people never know it's there, but if you listen closely on a calm evening, as the sun melts into the forest, you can almost hear it, the whisper of men building the impossible, the hum of engines that once cooled frozen walls, the echo of laughter in the snow, the voice of a dream that refused to sink.
In the end, Habakkuk never sailed. It never fought, never saved a convoy, never fired a single shot. But it remains one of the strangest, boldest, and most beautiful ideas of the Second World War. An idea that reminds us that even in times of war, the human mind is capable of wonder. And as the stars shimmer over the frozen lake, you can almost imagine it rising again. An immense, silent carrier of ice drifting across the dark Atlantic. Its deck glowing under the moon. A ghost ship made not of steel, but of hope. The ice aircraft carrier, Britain's frozen dream of war. The dream melted, but the legend never did.